Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Rice, Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. Welcome to our virtual White House Summit on eviction prevention. We're grateful you could join us to discuss this vital issue at this critical moment. The good news is that we're coming out of a tunnel. COVID cases are down. Jobs are up. Americans are starting to look beyond the devastating pandemic. At the same time, many people are still in a very deep economic hole. As this group knows well, that's especially true for those struggling to make rent. So this past Thursday, following the CDC's extension of the eviction moratorium for one final month, the Biden-Harris administration announced a series of steps to protect renters. But of course, that moratorium is only a reprieve. Millions of renters are still behind on rent and at risk of eviction. Our nation's renters need more. States, counties, cities, and tribes have had federal resources for rental assistance since late January. Renters at risk of eviction are desperate for that relief, and landlords need to cover their bills. We need relief distributed now, before the eviction moratorium expires at the end of July. The federal government is here to help, but it's fundamentally the responsibility of state and local governments to get the relief in the hands of renters and landlords. Last week, we updated our guidance, the federal guidance, to make it even easier for state and local governments to get the $46 billion in emergency rental assistance to families and renters who need it. That includes informing tenants of their rights and options for relief, and working with the legal and nonprofit community to promote eviction diversion programs that keep people in their homes and out of eviction court. At the federal level, our efforts to support states and localities are a whole of government endeavor. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, Treasury, Justice, Agriculture, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. As the President's domestic policy advisor, I help coordinate our efforts to marshal the collective resources of the federal government to help states and localities get rental assistance to those who need it most. Convening this summit is part of that effort. We must rise to meet this moment together, not just the federal government, but especially now state and local governments, as well as philanthropy and community-based organizations, pro bono attorneys and legal aid advocates, courts and judges, landlords and tenants. And we must do that recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach will not suffice. With Black and Latino households at higher risk of eviction before the pandemic, our response as we emerge from COVID must be rooted in equity in a way that reduces disparities instead of compounding them. It's not going to be easy, but I can tell you that President Biden is determined to do all we can to help states and localities do right by renters. As someone who took the train home every night to be with his sons, President Biden understands just how important it is to feel safe and secure under your own roof. So as we all work together to keep people in their homes, please know that you have committed partners in this administration. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you all for joining us today. As we continue to work to end this pandemic, this question, how to make sure families keep a roof over their head, is one of the most important our administration faces. That's because we know that when someone endures an eviction, that kind of personal economic crisis tends to follow them for a very long time. It's a phenomenon called economic scarring. Research by Matthew Desmond, from whom you'll hear shortly, has found that housing instability increases the risk of job loss by as much as 22 percentage points. For children, studies show housing instability leads to poor health and lower educational attainment, effects that can compound over time to reinforce inequality. And all of this must be viewed through the lens of racial equity. As you all know, evictions disproportionately affect communities of color. At Treasury, we're laser focused on making the American Rescue Plan funds stretch as far as possible to prevent evictions. Time is of the essence here. Too many tenants are at risk of eviction, and the eviction moratorium will expire at the end of next month. We're working with our partners at the state and local level to get this emergency rental money assistance funds into the hands of landlords and renters as soon as possible. Already, we've seen grantees implement promising practices to deliver this relief, including streamlined income verification processes and conducting culturally and linguistically relevant outreach. Last week, we released guidance encouraging emergency rental assistance grantees to develop partnerships with courts to avoid evictions. This is on top of the earlier changes to improving program efficiency, like requiring ERA2 programs to offer assistance directly to tenants, among others. And we have made clear that if grantees do not get this money to those who need it by the end of September, we will reallocate unused funds to those who can. We're committed to putting these funds to work to protect families and prevent as many evictions as we can. I know you share our commitment, and today's summit is about generating ideas to make good on them. Thank you again for being here today. We look forward to working with you in the coming weeks and months to deliver this critical aid to the American people. And with that, let me turn the floor over to my colleague, Gene Sperling.
Thank you very much, Wally and Mr. Deputy Secretary. President Biden likes to say that there's nothing we can't do if we do it together. The origins of this conference are a striking example of that. This started with us calling the president of the American Bar Association, Trish Rifo, and the president of the National Conference of Bar Presidents, Aurora Austriaco, and saying, do you think you could help? Do you want to work with us on trying to help mobilize the legal community to help prevent evictions with the potential of the eviction moratorium ending? Their response was not only absolutely, but let's get Ron Flagg, the president of the Legal Service Corporations, on the phone with us. Let's consult with the top community-based organizations, and let's start working every day, almost calls every other day until we get something done. That led to a decision to launch a plan to focus on 25 cities. And then it became 45 cities, and ultimately a White House conference. Their work initially with us, together with Emily Benfer, professor of law at Wake Forest, and Danielle Hirsch, who showed the exact same enthusiasm as the principal court management consultant for the National Center for State Courts, gave us the notion that there was an overwhelming willingness to work together on this, from advocates to those running programs, to those fighting for racial justice in communities, to the legal services, to the heights of the American Bar Association. As President Biden's White House coordinator of the American Rescue Plan, I can assure you there are few American Rescue Plan implementation issues as challenging or critical as emergency rental assistance to prevent evictions. The challenge is clear. While we have substantial funds through the American Rescue Plan, we as a nation have never had a national infrastructure to prevent unnecessary evictions. Indeed, even before the pandemic, our nation averaged 3.6 million evictions a year for missing rent as little as $500. So that's our challenge. We are asking our states and local governments to do everything they can to fill that void in a hurry. Some are ramping up admirably, some are lagging, but we all have to do better. For our administration, the fact that we have allocated the funds to the states and local governments quickly by May is not enough. As you've heard from Wally and Susan, we are looking every day at everything we can learn that's happening on the ground, from talking with advocates and experts and local governments to know what could we do to help make their job easier of setting up these programs. You can see that in the May 7th and June 24th guidance this administration gave out that reduced documentation, allowed more bulk payments, prevented discrimination against tenants, and made clear that states and local governments can use American Rescue Plan state and local funds and emergency rental assistance funds, not only to do back pay for landlords, but to help fund navigators, counselors, and the anti-eviction diversionary strategies that are at the heart of this White House conference. We are asking everyone to respond with speed and force because there is no alternative. With the CDC moratorium ending on July 31st, we are in a race with time. We must accelerate and expand the efforts of state and local governments, not only to get ERA money out the door to tenants and landlords, but to help those who've become homeless and to prevent racially disparate impacts from evictions across our nations. The billions of dollars provided through the emergency rental assistance offer more hope than ever that strategies for alternative to evictions, the diversionary strategies that you'll hear discussed today, can work. Where courts and cities require landlords and tenants to try to mediate their differences before going to court, where they ask for each to have proper representation, there will, for the first time ever, be major resources to fund these efforts and to make landlords completely whole while helping to ensure their tenants, those families, those renters can stay in their home, can have housing security, can fight off the threat of homelessness. As the CDC rightly recognized, those evicted are those who might be evicted will be more likely to be poor, minority, and with low vaccination rates. So the efforts that we are taking here are unquestionably a public health issue, but it is also a matter of racial justice. It's also a matter of basic economic security. And fundamentally, it is a matter of dignity, of the ability of parents and families to be able to care for their children with a degree of dignity that ensures a roof over their heads and basic housing security. I really, again, want to thank my colleagues, Susan Rice, the Deputy Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Housing, Fudge, that you will hear from, as well as the Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, for their leadership, their partnership. I also have to thank their teams, from Burden Walker at Justice to Noel Poyo at Treasury, to Peggy Bailey at HUD, Jacob Liebenluft, so many others. But I have to particularly thank Erica Pothig at Domestic Policy, who has just been the driving force of making sure that this White House conference took place. Now I really have a great honor, which is that I'm able to introduce our first presenter, Matthew Desmond. I don't think there's ever been a book written that did more to raise the profile of the pain and hardship of eviction, the issues that Wally spoke of, the downward cycle economically, and the personal hurt and harm and loss of dignity and health that comes from evictions, like Matthew Desmond did in his book, Evicted. He, unlike other people who often write a best-selling book and move on, he has dug in and dug in deeper, creating the Eviction Lab, being a top consultant who can provide advice, certainly to this White House. I greatly admire, and we should all admire, that he raised these issues front and center long before this pandemic hit. And so I think we could not have a stronger first presenter than Matthew Desmond. And Matt, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Gene. It's really good to be with you. I'm going to share my screen here. So even before the pandemic hit, we were in the midst of a really acute housing crisis for renters. Most renting families below the poverty line were spending at least half of their income on housing costs before COVID hit. And evictions were something that were visiting millions of families all across the country every year. As Jean mentioned, about 3.7 million evictions are filed in an average year in America. It's about 7 every minute. This isn't just a big city problem or an expensive city problem. Eviction affects cities large and small. It affects suburban and rural communities all across the country. This is a problem of national scope. It's also a problem that contributes to racial inequality. So African-American and Latino renters are evicted at much higher rates than white renters are across the United States. Eviction has been linked to homelessness, of course, but it has a lot of other consequences as well. Families lose their neighborhoods, their ties in the community. Kids lose their school. You often lose your possessions. Families are marked with eviction. A court record follows them around, and that can prevent them from moving into a decent home in a safe neighborhood, which is why studies show that after families get evicted, they move into housing that is worse than they lived in before. They move into neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and higher levels of poverty. Studies show that eviction causes job loss. And if any of you on this call have been evicted, you know why. It's such a consuming, stressful event. It can cause you to make mistakes at work, lose your footing in the labor market. And then there's the effects that eviction has on your health. Studies have linked eviction to poor infant health for moms that are pregnant. People that get evicted reports higher rates of depressive symptoms 2 years later. Psychologists have linked eviction to suicides. If we add all that up, we have to conclude, I believe, that eviction isn't just a condition of poverty, it's a cause of poverty, and it's a cause of serious moral alarm, especially now, because eviction is still linked to our public health crisis. This is the most recent data we have linking vaccination rates and eviction filing rates in neighborhoods across several cities. And what you find is the neighborhoods where families are at the highest risk of eviction also tend to be the neighborhoods with the lowest rates of vaccination. This is data from Houston, but we also see this repeated in Philadelphia, New York, and cities across the country. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do as the moratoria comes to a close, as about 1 in 7 American renters still report being behind in rent? We know that the moratoria prevented over 2 million evictions that probably would have happened given historical trends. So what are we going to do going forward? We could resort to the old way of doing business. This is a picture of eviction court in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and you'll see the stacks of eviction cases at the ready. In Charlotte, North Carolina, court commissioners are responsible for adjudicating about 100 eviction cases an hour. And they know they can get through the stack because many of those families who are facing displacement just don't show up. Outside of a select handful of American cities, tenants who are threatened with eviction don't have right to an attorney. Many landlords have representation, but many tenants who show up to eviction court don't. Many tenants don't show up at all because they know the deck is so stacked against them. Eviction court is not a court of justice, and it's not a court of fairness. And there's a way we can do and invent a better solution, and that is to really get behind eviction diversion programs. So what are the elements of these programs? I think that you can kind of really summarize the key elements with 3 A's. The first is advocacy. This is where tenants have a legal counsel by their side, they have a case manager by the side that walks through the entire process with them. Research shows that if we try to do advocacy on the cheap with bundled assistance or right-raising campaigns, for example, that doesn't have a big effect. What does have a big effect is when tenants have an attorney by their side. So in the Home Start program in Boston, an incredibly effective eviction prevention program, there's a caseworker that walks through every family that's being threatened with eviction at that time. And part of that advocate's job is to connect that family with resources. And this is the second A, assistance. We're talking about rental assistance, cash grants, connecting families with programs like SNAP or Medicaid, which they might have not had access to. So this is where legal counsel meets social service provision. And hopefully in that nexus, in that connection, there's an alternative to displacement where eviction becomes something that's off the table. So a court-mediated mediation or alternative dispute resolution is hopefully the result of this very simple targeted intervention. So for example, in Philadelphia, the landlord, the tenant, their counsel, and a mediator sit down and try to work out a solution that works for all parties involved. What does the research say about the success of these programs? It's incredibly encouraging. Third-party independent evaluations of eviction diversion programs all across the country show real returns on investment. These are cost-effective, incredibly efficient programs. So if you look at the bottom row, for example, Durham, North Carolina, over 70% of families that participated in the diversion program remained in their home. This is the opposite of what happens in conventional eviction courts, where most families that show up to court receive an eviction judgment. If you look in that middle row right there, that's a Home Starts program in Boston. You'll see that 95% of clients are still in their home 2 years later after the intervention, which included these 3 A's: advocacy, assistance, and an alternative process. So it's an incredibly encouraging results from a very simple intervention. So what are some of the best practices we see in diversion programs? Let me just offer a few. One is to intervene early, So you can think of an eviction process as being laid out with several steps. There's the eviction notice, the eviction filing, the hearing, the judgment, and then if a family is still in their home after the judge tells them to leave, that's when the court marshal gets involved and physically removes a family and their belongings from the home. The research suggests that the best place to intervene and divert the eviction process is at the very beginning, and let me tell you why. Local studies show that about a third of tenants move out after they get eviction filing, but before going to court. So if we intervene after the eviction is filed, that means we might miss a big chunk of families that could really have used a diversion. If we intervene after an eviction is filed, that means we intervene after a landlord has paid money to start a court process. It's costly to the landlord. And it's also costly to the tenant because an eviction filing goes on your record. That could affect your credit and your future housing options, even if eviction doesn't result in a judgment. And if you try to mediate in the court setting, you might define success as something other than keeping tenants in their home. This is kind of like a court-mediated move-out where a property owner says, okay, I'll drop the eviction charge, but you have to be out in a week. That to me doesn't sound like success in this case. And this is kind of the second best practice I want to elevate, which is when we're designing new diversionary programs, I think we need to clearly define what success means. So I suggest that success means 3 things in this case. It means keeping families safely housed, it means keeping their records clean, and it means keeping property owners solvent. And so as Jean mentioned, sometimes families are housed in unsafe places, and ERA funds can be used to relocate those families. But I think that if a diversionary program only helps one of the 2 parties, it's not working, right? And so we've seen in the pandemic, some diversionary programs paid landlords rent relief that took care of their problems, but didn't take steps to prevent families getting evicted. So the rental debt would go on, but the eviction went ahead. I don't think that's a successful program. It has to work for both parties. Third is we need to think about how to increase maximum participation in these programs. So we can build the best diversionary program imaginable, but if only a small chunk of our property owners participate, it's not going to have a wide reach. So Philadelphia mandates participation in their diversionary program before evictions can be filed in court. Texas requires property owners to let tenants know about diversionary programs during the eviction filing. I think these are ways to integrate diversionary programs into the process, to make it not something that's extra voluntary, but something that's actually part of how a city adjudicates these disputes. And last, I just want to encourage all of us to build something that lasts. Build something that lasts. This is an opportunity not to go back to normal. Because for so many renters around the country, normal was broken, normal was painful. And this is a chance to reinvent how we adjudicate and address the eviction crisis in a way that's more fair, that works for tenants and property owners better than the status quo, in a way that clearly invests in home, in families, and communities with the recognition that without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jean.
Thank you, Matt. That was excellent, and I think incredibly informative, and leads, I think, beautifully into our next panel. As I was thanking people, I of course forgot to thank my own staffer, Devin O'Connor. So thank you, Devin, and many others. But I now want to introduce what I really think is just an extraordinarily important panel, because it has all of the key, or at least many of the key players that will need to come together to have successful diversionary strategies. And so I would like to introduce our moderator, someone who I've mentioned already before as being inspirational to the process that led to this conference, Patricia, or Trish Rifo, who is the president of the American Bar Association. And so, Trish, I will turn it over to you to moderate this, again, very, very excellent panel.
Thank you, Jean. You know, the American Bar Association has been working on the looming eviction crisis for more than a year, and we enthusiastically and with delight welcomed your outreach and the Biden-Harris administration's leadership on this deeply important issue. And I am simply here to say the lawyers of America are here to do our part. We stand ready to help. This panel will focus on court and community-based eviction diversion programs that provide landlords and tenants with access to rental assistance and a forum for resolving eviction cases equitably and outside of the court process, with the ultimate goal, of course, of housing stability. The American Bar Association teamed up with the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program to identify best practices to divert eviction filings and enhance housing stability. We have a fabulous set of experts here today to delve more deeply into some of the insights that are captured in the report, Designing for Housing Stability. Chief Justice Bridget McCormick is the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, which has made enormous strides to coordinate with emergency rental assistance programs and divert evictions. Rashida Phillips is managing attorney of the housing policy for Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, which worked with the city of Philadelphia to pass legislation that diverts evictions and, more recently, protect tenants from being screened out of housing because of past evictions. Renee Solis is Chief Program Officer at Baker Ripley, a social service organization in the Houston region that is administering one of the best emergency rental assistance programs in the country. And Gilbert Wynn is CEO of Wynn Companies, a national affordable housing provider that has trained over 1,700 of its staff in housing stability model that has resulted in zero evictions for non-payment of rent over the last 15 months. Justice McCormick, let me start with you and ask if you could discuss briefly some best practices at the state and local level for diverting eviction cases from courts.
Yeah, thank you very much for including me on this panel and for the partnership we are seeing. State courts need the federal government to partner with us to succeed, and we're grateful for this opportunity. I also want to stress three things that I think are important to a successful eviction diversion program, and that is leadership, collaboration, and representation. I was gonna talk a little bit about why diversion programs are so important, but I see no need to do that because Matt Desmond does it better than I could possibly do. So I'm scrapping that part of my outline and moving to what I think matters for court leaders who might be listening. Eviction diversion programs are win-win-win, I like to say. They're they're sort of a unicorn in courts because tenants want to stay in their apartments, landlords need their money to pay their bills, and courts have tremendous backlogs, especially after this pandemic. So if you can stand up a successful eviction diversion program in your jurisdiction, you have an opportunity to have a win-win-win solution. But you need leadership, you need collaboration, you need representation. I could give you lots of details about what Michigan's statewide eviction diversion program is doing, but it's not important because every local jurisdiction that has a successful program or state that has a successful statewide program has their own specific rules, statutes, and partners that they have to deal with. So I think what's most important is to emphasize that leaders, court leaders in particular, can bring people together to make effective programs, but you need that collaboration. In Michigan, our diversion program, which was modeled on local programs before we made it statewide last fall, brings together local housing authorities, community partners, and all three branches of government to manage this incredible help with the American Rescue Plan funding to put towards our statewide diversion program. And with that collaboration, we were able to come up with a process that works for everybody. In our state, we had to slow down the summary process. We had to move most of it to remote platforms. And the third piece that I wanted to make sure everybody understands is representation is important. Tenants need help. In Detroit in particular, only 4% of tenants had legal help in eviction processes before our diversion program. With our diversion program, everybody gets help. Representation is really important to make the program work. And I can give you lots of statistics that will tell the story about how successful it's been. In Michigan so far, we've had 40,000 applications, and there have been 9,400 cases that have resulted in payments of $65 million already, and there are significant more in the pipeline which are going to be successful as well. You should know that the National Center for State Courts eviction diversion tool at www.ncsc.org/eviction diversion is a wonderful sort of BuzzFeed type quiz tool to help figure out what might work in your jurisdiction. You don't have to do what Michigan did. You have to do what works in your jurisdiction. And the National Center can provide some technical assistance to courts interested in setting up diversion programs. But with leadership, collaboration, and representation, you can stand up a successful diversion program that will literally save lives and be good for your communities. I know we have so many other excellent speakers. I could say a lot more, but I want to make sure everybody else has an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Justice McCormick. And I want to turn now to Rashida. You've done such a terrific job in Philadelphia, and mindful of the Chief Justice's admonition that every place is different. Perhaps you could share with us what's been successful and what you've been doing in Philadelphia.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So in Philly, we're developing 3 interconnected solutions that are specifically tailored to re-envision how evictions are carried out. All of them have been named by my co-panelists, but the first is right to counsel for tenants. The second is sealing or limiting access to eviction records, and the third is eviction diversion. We see each of those 3 components as critical in and of themselves, but together they're targeted to undermine the current eviction system and to increase access to housing opportunities. And we also are encouraged to see each of those elements highlighted in President Biden and Vice President Harris's announcements on initiatives to promote housing stability. So I'll just share very briefly about how each of those 3 components are working here. So, Matthew Desmond, Professor Desmond already described some of the elements of the eviction diversion program in Philly that make it effective, but primarily having the mandatory pre-filing nature of it, having a mandate for application to the rental assistance program allows us to both help and address individual needs as well as have significant systemic reform. We also are pairing folks with housing counselors and trained volunteer mediators to also connect them to additional resources, again, as Professor Desmond described. Second, right to counsel in eviction cases, which ensures that those tenants who have legal defenses, who have fair housing and substandard housing issues, things that need to be litigated and that are not supported by a sort of diversion model, right? Having right to counsel ensures that people are able to access justice and able to put up legal defenses and have their day in court. Last week, Philadelphia made a historic and significant investment of $3 million in our eviction prevention program, which will enable us to roll out the beginning stages of a right to counsel program. And then finally, just to highlight our last initiative, and again, the way that we're thinking about these 3 things together, regulation and expungement or sealing of eviction records and screening protections, which open up access to housing by preventing evictions from having those adverse effects and that follow tenants for life, for the rest of their lives, because they can't get those records sealed or expunged. And so last week, Philadelphia City Council passed the Renters Access Act. It's an anti-discrimination and race equity tool, which is meant to give thousands of renters who are impacted by eviction records a better chance at securing safe and stable housing, particularly as they recover from the pandemic. And some of the things that that act provides, among other things, it regulates the tenant screening practices and roots out these kind of biases by prohibiting these blanket exclusions of people with eviction records, creating look-back periods. It prohibits landlords from looking at failure to pay rent or utility bills during the COVID-19 emergency period, and also prevents them from looking at certain types of records. So again, and we see these tools as working interconnectedly. We see them specifically as race equity tools, much like the rest of the country. Philadelphia mirrors it, and that are the people who are most impacted by evictions are Black women, their children, and African-American families, not even accounting for income. And so this is beyond a poverty issue, right? It's a racial justice and gender justice and disability justice issue. So all of these tools work together to address those issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rashida, and thank you for all you're doing in Philadelphia. As we all know, there is $46 billion available in relief at the state and the local level to cover rent owed to landlords. And so let me turn to Renee Solis and ask you, Renee, obviously in Houston and in Harris County, you all have been working hard, both with outreach to landlords and tenants and working with your court system. Talk to us a bit about what you've been doing in Houston and Harris County and what results you've been seeing there.
Yes, thank you, Trish. Let me talk about some strategies that we have here in Houston and Harris County. The first strategy I would point out is how we developed a joint coordinated access for the rental assistance program. At the onset of the pandemic in April of 2020, City of Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner and County Judge Lina Hidalgo established the Housing Stability Task Force. The task force was led by State Representative Armando Wally and former Shell Oil CEO Marvin Odom. It was through this task force and through the leadership of housing advocates, community-based organizations, landlords, and the city and county where it was agreed that we should have one program for the region with a single point of access so that it would be easier for landlords and tenants to enroll. I would also define this critical point as our first major milestone, which paved the way for the success of our program. The next strategy, or the second effective strategy of the Houston-Harris Emergency Rental Assistance Program that I would like to point out is to what I refer to as the Texas two-step. In the Texas two-step strategy, we recognize that both the landlord and the tenant play a valuable role in the distribution of the rental assistance funds. As Matt Desmond mentioned in his presentation, it has to work for both parties and keep people in their homes. As such, we had separate outreach, communication, and enrollment plans for the landlords and the tenants. For the landlords, we engaged the Houston Apartment Association and coordinated discussions with City of Houston and Harris County and landlords so that we could establish a mutual agreement on the program terms for the landlords. We recognize that pushing too much on landlords with so much uncertainty around the pandemic would adversely impact the tenants if landlords failed to enroll in the program. In our first set of funding, or in our first wave of funding, $15 million in May of 2020, we had close to 8,000 landlord locations participating. Today, we have close to 19,000 landlord locations participating, and access is being provided to tenants. The final point I would like to highlight is a strategy to look at capacity and engage multiple partners. By the end of 2020, Baker Ripley had distributed all of the $70 million in rental assistance allocated to the program. But it was clear that rental assistance needs were still growing and additional resources would become available, which would need to be distributed quickly. Through our partner with the city and county, we brought in additional partners and created a much larger collaboration for the distribution of rental assistance. Catholic Charities of Houston Galveston joined our efforts and became a second administrator of the program and helped expand our region's capacity for processing eligibility and payments. They, by the way, did not reinvent the wheel, but instead used the same system and processes we created in 2020. We also brought in 9 CBO organizations that came in as navigators. These organizations focused on outreach, technical assistance to tenants and landlords, and help address gaps and provide other resources to tenants, while Baker Ripley and Catholic Charities focused on eligibility and payments. The results we are seeing are impressive. We distributed $70 million in 2020, and we distributed already $120 million in 2021. And we are not done yet. We are now processing applications for the additional $53 million that have been allocated to City of Houston and Harris County in this next round of funding.
Thank you, Renee, for that wonderful summary of all the work you've been doing in Houston. And I want to turn now, Gilbert, to you. Obviously, an eviction starts when a landlord files for an eviction. Your companies have taken a very different approach. And I wonder if you could talk with us sort of about what it is you've done and the why behind it.
Yes, thank you, Trish. First, I wanted to start with some statistics. So our properties have received over $9 million in rental assistance on behalf of 18,000 residents and 6,000 apartments over the last 15 months. The vast majority of those payments were received in 21. Currently, we have over 8 million in applications pending across 16 states. That number is growing every day. I wanted to thank the administration as well as Congress for the robust rental assistance funding that it created to match fund the restrictions that came with the eviction moratorium. It was very much needed. The question as to why, Trish, is that Wynn Companies is the largest operator of affordable housing in the United States. We own many properties, but we also manage for a wide range of owners, from large private owners to small nonprofits, even housing authorities. We manage tax credit properties, Section 8, naturally occurring affordable housing, and 10,000 market rate units. We're in small cities, rural areas, and suburbs. We're in 23 states. What's the point? The point is that Wynn Companies needed to figure out a plan that would divert evictions all across the country. It's why we're here today. And that's what our plan does. Before I hit on the points of the plan, I wanted to quickly express two fundamental principles we're guided by. The first principle is that payment and collection of rent is critical to rental housing, especially in affordable housing. The issue can't be distilled to renters versus profits, because as rent goes uncollected, variable operating costs that affect everyone's quality of life have to be cut. Preventative maintenance, landscaping, security, trash pickup, resident service provisions, frontline workers' hours at the property. These are not things that are acceptable to anyone. Rent is required. I think the real estate industry, by and large, has done a wonderful job over the pandemic, keeping people safe in their homes on the front line. But there was a second principle as well, equally important, that renters deserve a safety net if they fall on hard times through no fault of their own. The bottom line is that Wynn's plan for housing stability aims to reduce non-payment evictions by 50% across our portfolio nationwide by 2025. The plan will create upstream steps, such as providing resident education on rights and lease responsibilities, connect residents with area resources, such as counseling and financial coaching, pursue interventions such as recertification of incomes that date back months if necessary to the actual date of the income loss. It's going to focus on robust coordination and assistance with completing rental assistance applications, which many affordable renters find daunting. We're going to integrate achievable, affordable, and sustainable payment agreements, often as long as 9 months if necessary. So we're actually solving back rent instead of kicking the can down the road. We're going to create accountable housing stability goals rather than eviction goals for our on-site property managers, as well as the over 100 law firms that we work with nationwide. And to avoid court wherever possible, we're going to use a pre-court checklist that's required to be exhausted before we even allow evictions to be filed by our staff. It's important to note that all of these tools require tenant willingness and tenant participation to work. It has to be a partnership. In closing, we began crafting this program prior to the pandemic, and we believe it's a national blueprint and a toolkit for large and small landlords alike. This plan is not focused only on August 1st. It's built for all the August 1sts after that. This issue requires long-term and constant focus. Thanks.
Thank you, Gilbert, and your voice in this discussion is so important. I'm going to very briefly ask each of our panelists to do something very unfair, but I told you in advance I was going to do it, so maybe it's not unfair. In less than 1 minute, give us something concrete, either that you're going to do or that you recommend other locations do in the next month to help prevent evictions over the course of this summer. Chief Justice McCormick, I'll start with you.
Well, for me, it's a little bit easy. We're going to figure out what we do in Michigan, given that we still have significant CARES Act funding to contribute to this solution, and figure out how to extend it and figure out best practices from around the state. I would ask everybody else to go onto the National Center website, use that tool, and figure out what will work in your local community and stand up and do it. You can do it.
Great suggestion. Rashida.
Yeah, so in the next few months, Philadelphia is looking forward to rolling out our Right to Counsel program, and that would be my suggestion for other localities, to make sure if you have an eviction diversion program that it is working in conjunction with Right to Counsel, and it's taking into account these other principles, you know, the more long-term effects and impacts that eviction records and evictions themselves have on people's lives. And so again, thinking about those three solutions as working interconnectedly would be my pitch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rashida. Renee, to you.
Yes, my recommendation would be to look at the data and listen to your community as to the efforts that you've made to date and identify gaps in the delivery of resources. And just check that there's no vulnerable neighborhoods or individuals and people out there that have not yet been served.
Thank you, Renee. And finally, Gilbert, to you. One thing in the next month.
Sure. I mentioned this earlier. We're going to be meeting with the 100 private law firms we work with in 23 states, and we're going to be changing their incentive structures so that we can educate them on housing stability and say that an eviction diverted receives the same incentives as an eviction completed. And we think that's going to be an education and really work to help divert evictions.
Thank you, Gilbert, and thank you to all of our panelists. This was a terrific conversation, and I'm very appreciative to each of you for being part of this. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce the Associate Attorney General of the United States, Vanita Gupta.
Thank you so much, Trish, and thanks to all of you. That was an absolutely terrific discussion. So today's program to me really highlights the impact of housing and evictions on people's access to jobs, to healthcare, to schools, to safety, and more. And there is no question that this is a racial justice issue. It's a gender justice issue. It's a disability justice issue. It's a poverty and economic security issue, and it's a public health issue. I think what the panel discussion has highlighted for me most of all is that confronting this crisis is going to take intensive collaboration among the voices that we just heard from. Everyone from landlords to bar leadership, legal services providers, the courts, and rental assistance program administrators. All of us have an obligation to pitch in and help to do whatever we can to keep families in their homes. We know, and we've heard from Matthew Desmond on this, but we know that we've never had the infrastructure that we need to keep people in their homes and to prevent evictions. And the pandemic has only exacerbated this crisis tenfold. And so it's going to take all of us on this call and beyond to address this unprecedented challenge. This is why last week I sent a letter to Chief Justice McCormick and her counterparts at state Supreme Courts around the country to highlight the role that state courts can play in preventing evictions. My letter highlighted a number of steps that courts could take to help stem the tide of evictions right away. First, courts could consider issuing orders requiring landlords to apply for rental assistance in advance of filing for evictions. And for pending cases, courts could follow the lead of Chief Justice McCormick's court and put cases on a slower track to allow rental assistance to be filed, processed, and paid out. And in addition, courts should also consider amending summonses and court notices to alert litigants on the availability of rental assistance. Over the longer term, we know that eviction diversion programs are most successful when they are comprehensive. And as outlined in the joint ABA-Harvard study that was published last week, this means combining access to rental assistance with legal representation, mediation, and social services. I recognize, of course, that robust eviction programs require financial support, and I hope that it has been made clear today that the federal government stands ready to help. The Treasury Department has made clear that COVID relief funds, both the $350 billion in state and local relief, as well as the $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance program funds, can be used to support court-supported diversion programs. And of course, we also know that eviction diversion strategies cannot be a one-size-fits-all. Jurisdictions are experiencing and will experience this crisis differently. And it's why our friends at the National Center for State Courts have put together a very useful tool that will allow you to figure out what set of diversion programs is going to work best for your community. And so we urge you to turn to that tool and to use it. As I wrote in my letter, I really believe that it is the obligation of everyone, of each and every one of us in the legal community, to do everything that we can to help. For millions of families across this country, the stakes are simply too high for any of us to sit this one out, and it will take organizing on our part of our colleagues and of other stakeholders to make sure we are leaving no stone unturned to ensure housing security in these unprecedented times. But it is why also I feel a great amount of hope to be here with all of you today. I hope that you'll be able to use the sessions following this set of presentations to discuss in very concrete ways the actions that you can take in your community to combat this crisis. I encourage you to reach out to others in your community, especially to legal aid providers, social services providers, courts and court administrators, to discuss how all of them and all of us can be part of the solution. So thank you again for your time and for your effort. And to echo again, Matthew Desmond, I do believe this is our opportunity to turn this iteration of the crisis to build long-term strategies and infrastructure for housing security, and not just try to return to the pre-pandemic status quo. And we can do this together. So let me now ask Secretary Fudge to offer some concluding remarks. Secretary Fudge.
My thanks to Jean Sperling and all my fellow members of the Biden-Harris administration who are joining this summit. Our shared participation makes it clear the President recognizes the urgency of the issue. And I want to thank Peggy Bailey on our team as well. Thank you for all the very hard work you've done to get us to this point. And thank you, every person tuning in for this summit, to all the elected leaders, state and local officials, legal experts, and housing advocates watching right now. Each of you has a critical role to play in helping millions of Americans remain in their homes, and I am honored to work alongside you. We all know COVID-19 has devastated our nation. Roughly 10 million Americans are currently behind on their rent payments. We know as well that the pandemic has exacted an especially heavy toll on people of color and upon people of modest means. Many folks might be familiar with the old expression, when America catches a cold, Black America catches pneumonia. A similar statement can be made about marginalized communities throughout our country, about people of color from nearly every background, about folks who live in small towns, in rural communities, and on tribal lands. When President Biden entered the White House, he understood the urgency of the crisis confronting our country. Thanks to his visionary leadership in passing the American Rescue Plan, our federal government is now delivering historic amounts of relief for people who have fallen behind during the pandemic. In addition, the Department of Justice is urging our courts to support local landlords in securing federal funding instead of evicting their struggling tenants. I promise you, HUD will do our part as well. We understand it is not easy for our state and local partners to stand up new relief in the midst of a crisis. HUD stands ready to provide the guidance and the support you need to assist renters and landlords in your communities. Please reach out to us if there is anything we can do to help. Over the past 16 months, we have all been reminded just how important it is to have a safe and stable place to call home. Thanks to the leadership of President Biden, our country is making significant strides in rebuilding from COVID-19. Our economy is surging, more Americans are getting vaccinated, life is beginning to feel closer to normal. We cannot allow a wave of evictions to jeopardize the progress we have made as a nation. We must take urgent action to safeguard the housing security of millions of our fellow Americans. That is why I am so grateful the White House has brought all of us together for this conversation. And it is why I am committed to working with each of you in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best with the rest of today's summit.
That is the end of our public session. I think it was just tremendously informative. I hope others did too. Please let us know. And this will be one of many, many actions, convenings, efforts that we will be making to do everything we can to make sure our nation is prepared for the end of the moratorium. And as Matt Desmond said, to make sure that we're building something that's not just for this crisis, but a lasting infrastructure for dealing with unnecessary and very painful evictions for the future. Thank you again for everybody who participated. Thank you for everybody who is listening and joined us. Thank you.